Chapter 5. The Burning Valley, Camivore. Callista strode down the length of the marching column, walking against the flow of soldiers. The hosts marched in serried ranks, sandaled feet striking the hard, cracked earth in perfect unison, making a great dust cloud rise in their wake. There had been no rain for almost 2 seasons now, and there was already talk of the drought's impact on the kingdom's granaries. A hungry army was of great concern to Callista, but that was a problem for another day. The soldiers lifted their spears into the air as she passed, but she did not return their salute. Her expression was grim, and her gaze fixed on the huge enclosed litter. The royal palanquin was massive, larger than most low-born homes, and it was carried on the shoulders of 50 sweating soldiers of the host. They had been marching for 3 days through the unrelenting heat. The soldiers bearing the palanquin were rotated every 2 hours, so that their progress did not slow. They began their march before dawn, trudging on without interruption until stopping for a brief break in the middle of the day, then continuing until after sunset. It was a grueling pace, but it would see them back to the capital city of Alavedra in 2 days. The queen still lived, and Callista thanked the ancestors for that mercy. Isilde might well have died at the banquet if not for Mikkel's chalice. There was a dark irony in that. Their attack on Santoris might have precipitated the assassination attempt, yet it had also delivered them the magical artifact that kept the queen alive. In truth, Callista was somewhat surprised the artifact actually worked and was not merely a trinket used as an excuse for the attack on Santoris. The sacred chalice had divine healing properties, and so after the queen collapsed, water was hastily poured into it and it was held to her lips. However, its power, even magnified by the innate talent of the king's advisor Nuno, was unable to halt the spread of poison. It slowed it, however, which at least brought them time to find a cure. While the queen yet lived, there remained hope. But as Callista headed toward the dusty palanquin, she shook her head bitterly. It should never have come to this. She cursed herself for acting too slowly. She cursed herself for not seeing the assassins earlier, for not shouting out sooner. She cursed herself for not being fast enough, or strong enough, or clever enough to have forestalled this tragedy. She was lauded for saving the king's life, but she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a failure. Her spear might have deflected the assassin's blade from its true target, but that deflection had caused the queen's affliction. It haunted her, and she kept going over the assassination attempt in her mind, thinking about what she would have done differently, how she could have better protected Viego and Isilde. Callista pushed aside her regret and self-recrimination as she approached the litter. The guards surrounding it allowed her through with a nod. A golden staircase extended from the front of the litter, reaching down almost to the ground. Callista stepped onto it, somewhat uncomfortable in the knowledge that her weight was now borne upon the backs of her soldiers. She removed her helmet and she climbed the stairs, tucking it under one arm. The heavy canvas sides of the litter had been tied back, allowing airflow and light within, but the sheer silk curtain were lowered for privacy. A guard opened the way, sweeping the silk aside. The interior was fully furnished and opulent, as befitted the royal couple. It was so luxurious, and the movement of the litter was so steady that Callista had to remind herself that they were not in the palace. The queen lay upon the massive bed, unconscious, which was certainly better than when she was racked with pain and delirium. Viego sat at her side, holding one of her limp hands. He looked up at Callista as Callista entered. His eyes were red and hollow, with deep rings below them. Callista didn't think he had slept since his queen had been struck down. The royal physician, Ramon, was dressing Isilde's wounds, applying fresh bandages after completing his inspection. He had arrived several hours earlier, after riding from the city to meet them. Callista knew him well, for he'd served the royal family for decades. He'd tended her when she broke her arm as a child after trying to ride an unbroken stallion bareback, and again when she almost drowned after jumping off a headland of Camor's End which rose almost 100 feet from the sea. "Well?" said Viego, his voice hoarse. Ramon sighed and wiped the sweat from his brow. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen before," he said. "I will need to see how it responds to the healing poultice, but I am not confident that I will be able to do more than ease her pain. The darkness is spreading beneath her skin. It's slow, but I fear that it will, in time, reach her heart. I'm truly sorry, Your Majesty. Short of a miracle, I'm not sure what more I will be able to do." Callista's heart wrenched. Viego didn't react, and didn't take his gaze off Isilde. Ramon turned and looked at Callista. There was a genuine sadness in his eyes, and his shoulders slumped. She gave him a tired smile and patted him on the back. His diagnosis wasn't a surprise, at least to her. "So you can't do anything?" asked Viego. The king hadn't spoken aggressively, and hadn't so much as looked up from Isilde, but Callista knew him well enough to recognize the warning signs. "Viego," she cautioned. "My lord king," began Ramon, but Viego silenced him, turning toward him with one slender finger leveled. "No!" he hissed. "If you don't have anything to say that can help my queen, don't say another word." "I might be able to help her if I knew what the poison was." Callista winced inwardly. If Viego had not killed that last assassin, they might have gleaned that information. Viego surged upright, grabbing the physician by the front of his tunic. Like Callista, the king was tall and wolf-lean, with an iron strength in his limbs. Ramon gaped like a landed fish. "What good is a healer who cannot heal?" Viego snarled. "Viego, leave him be!" Callista said, placing a hand on his shoulder, but he ignored her. He marched Ramon backward. The old physician's sandals scuffed and slid, struggling for purchase as he was pushed toward the exit. "If you cannot help, then do something useful and find someone who can." With a savage grunt, Viego shoved Ramon out of the pavilion. He tumbled down the stairs with a cry before hitting the dusty earth with a dull thud. Breathing heavily, Viego turned to his vigil at Isilde's side and took her hand back in his own. Through the sheer silk curtains, Callista saw the physician struggling to regain his feet. "I cannot lose her, Cal," Viego whispered. "I don't care what it costs. I can't lose her." Callista pursed her lips and said nothing. Without further word, she turned and strode from the royal pavilion. Descending a golden stairway, she slipped from her plumed helm back in place and dropped lightly to the ground. "Forgive him," she said, as she helped Ramon stand. The old man was covered in orange dust, and doubtless had a few bruises, but it seemed only his pride had been hurt in the fall. "He is suffering. The queen is his world." The physician looked grim as he made a vain attempt to brush the worst of the dust from his robe. "Then I fear what is to come," he said, "for it is my belief that the queen will not recover. He was always unpredictable and unwillful, even as a child. What will he do when his world dies?" Callista had no good answer for that. "I grieve for the queen, and I feel for the king, I truly do," Ramon continued. "But Camavor needs a strong and stable ruler. Is he that?" "Careful, old man," Callista said in a low voice. She did not like the ways this conversation was turning. "He is young, and he is in pain, but he is also your sworn king, remember?" He shrugged. "There's a lot more of the old king in you than in Viego, Callista. Would that you sat on the Argent throne?" "Never voice that sentiment again," Callista snapped. Ramon looked her in the eye, then grunted. "I'm not sure my presence will be welcome if the worst comes to pass," he said. He bowed his head and gave her a sad smile. "It has been an honor serving your family, but I think it is time that I take my leave." Callista watched him go, feeling like she was slowly drowning. "You made a promise," she reminded herself. "A promise to a dying king." He stood among the pantheon of ancestors now, watching and judging. Protect Viego. Protect Camavor. I'm trying, she whispered. The leaders of the various knightly orders and their senior captains were gathered in Hecarim's lavish command tent, standing around a map laid out across the table. Callista stood among them, arms folded across her chest, a deep frown on her face. Ledros was with her, though he remained in shadows behind the nobles, as befitted one of low birth. We cannot allow such an attack to go unpunished, declared Lord Sedona, Grand Master of the Golden Shield. We would look like weak fools. And who do you propose we retaliate against? Asked Lady Aurora of the Ebonhorns. We do not know who sent them. Sedona jabbed a gloved finger at the map. Half the world's assassins hail from Port Takan. For too long the High Lords have harbored them. I say we strike there and make an example of them. Show them what happens to those who dare threaten Camivor. Port Takan is an ally, protested Aurora. So was Santoris, Sedona sneered, and now it's part of Camivor. That was a holy war, ordained by the priesthood, growled Lord Ardono. The Knights of the Azure Flame were renowned for their piety, and Callista knew that their Grand Master was particularly devout. Sedona smirked. I'm sure we can find a priest who will proclaim it will, in the will of the ancestors, to see Port Takan burn to the ground, if that's what you need. Ardono scowled, his face flushing. The revered ancestors are not fools to be cynically wielded in games of war and politics, Sedona. They will not be mocked. Oh, come now! The priests play a more ruthless game of politics than anyone at court. Even you can't think otherwise, surely. Ardono looked set to argue further, but Callista interjected. Even if the assassins did come from Port Takan, it is unlikely that the High Lords have anything to do with it, she said. Anyone could have hired them. It is not as if we are short on enemies. And with the killers dead, it is unlikely we will ever know who was behind it, added Hecarim. Doing nothing will merely embolden others, snapped Sedona. So you would have us attack an ally, knowing they were likely not responsible, just for a show of strength? Callista shot back. If it would put some fear into others who might wish strike against us, then yes, I would, in a heartbeat. Callista was shocked at the brazenness of this admission. The thought of starting another unjustified war against an ally merely to appear strong made her feel sick. How many more innocents would die? There must be another way. The jackals are circling, Sedona continued. They feared the lion, but the lion is dead and his young cub is still largely untested. Santoris was a good start, but a further demonstration of power and ruthlessness is necessary. If our enemies do not learn to fear him, we will be picked apart piece by piece. Callista struggled to maintain her composure. Did you really just call your king an untested cub? I meant no disrespect, but we must speak plainly, said Sedona. Your grandfather would have agreed with this course of action. He'd have leveled Port Takan already. Does it not occur to you that my grandfather's brutal conquest likely created the enemies we now face? That our victory over Santoris simply ensures that we have more enemies tomorrow? And that striking against Port Takan will make our other allies wonder if they are next and plan accordingly? We created this cycle of violence, war, and retribution. It is time to break it, not continue it. This is Camivor, declared Sedona. If we create more enemies, then so be it. We will destroy them as well. Callista's expression darkened. Your intentions are clumsy and obvious, Sedona, she hissed. Long have you coveted the wealth of Port Takan, which lies conveniently near the stronghold of the Golden Shield. You seek to use the assassination attempt to justify a new war for your own gain, a war Camivor can ill afford. How dare you, Sedona bristled, hand closing around the hilt of his sword. Callista felt more than heard the low warning rumble from Ledros. It was the sound of a war dog rising to meet a challenge. Of course, if the giant captain made a move against the Grandmaster, his life would be forfeit, no matter the mitigating circumstances. She raised her hand, calming him. Enough, Hecarim boomed. The queen lies grievously wounded not 50 paces away. Now is not the time to turn on one another. Sedona wheeled on him. She dishonors the legacy of the lion, by Hecarim's sword hissed from its scabbard. Lady Callista does not need anyone to fight her battles for her, least of all me, he growled, blade pointed at Sedona. But if you say one more disrespectful word, I will call you out. Sedona's face was red. You want to take Port Dakan just as much as I do, he snapped. Not like this, said Hecarim, and not behind the king's back while he tends to the queen. If we ever move against Dakan, it will only be at the express order of the Argent Throne. Sedona stared at Hecarim, then nodded. My apologies, good lady, he offered, with the slightest bow toward Callista, though he didn't look her in the eye. I spoke in haste. Hecarim sheathed his blade, and Lord Sedona made an excuse to leave. One by one, the other knights followed him out. Entertaining as always, remarked Lady Aurora with a wry grin. Though I would have paid good money to see you or Lady Callista beat him down. She filed out with her own knights, leaving Callista and Ledros alone with Hecarim and a few senior members of the Iron Order. Your captain here needs to learn to control himself, said Hecarim. I'd say he did, replied Callista. Sedona still has arms. Hecarim smirked and glanced up at Ledros. Hecarim was half a head shorter than the low-born captain, but Ledros' bulk made him seem even larger. Fair point, Hecarim conceded. Sedona said you want to take Port Dakan as much as he does, Callista said, eyes narrowing. I was not aware of that. Is the king? Hecarim sighed and rubbed his hand across his face, suddenly looking tired. Talk of conquest and legacy feels unimportant right now. Inappropriate right now, given the situation, he said. But for some of the orders, the promise of glory is what keeps them loyal. But not the Iron Order? Hecarim smiled again, but this time it seemed more honest, more real. In the past? He said. Of course it was. But with our betrothal, the fates of the Iron Order and Camivore are intertwined. It's time to move beyond the endless quest for glory and look for a better future for all of Camivore and for all Camivorans. Callista frowned, unable to hide her surprise. This was not what she had expected from him. He rubbed his eyes again. It seemed like he was allowing his mask to drop, and she would be lying if she said she was not pleased by what she saw. Get some rest, my lady, Hecarim said. It's still 2 days' hard march before we reach Alavedra. Callista was silent as she walked through the darkened camp, back to her tent. Ledros, her equal, silently shadowed. Do you trust him? Ledros asked. When they were back in the host assigned section. I don't know, admitted Callista. But I would like to.